Okay, it's noon sharp. Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Morita, and I am Executive Acquisitions Editor with Springer Publishing. I'm honored to welcome you to today's webinar, The Importance of Pedagogy in Online Nursing Education, Lessons Learned from the Pandemic Pivot. This is presented by Dr. Stephanie Stymack-DeBoer. A few things before we get started. Video of the presentation will be available on Springer's website about a week from now, and each of you will receive an email notification when it's posted, and we'll provide a link so you can access that with ease. Also, please feel free to ask questions in the Zoom Q&A. We will collect the questions throughout the presentation, and I'll ask Dr. DeBoer to answer them at the end of the presentation. Dr. Stephanie Stymack-DeBoer is Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Associate Professor at the Orvis School of Nursing, University of Nevada, Reno. She is editor of Keating's Curriculum Development and Evaluation in Nursing Education, 5th edition, which was just published by Springer in February. She contributed a chapter to Marilyn Orman's text, Teaching and Nursing and Role of the Educator. She has published articles in the Journal of Nursing Education, Journal of Nursing Care Quality, and American Journal of Critical Care. Among her many accolades, she most recently received the 2021 University of Nevada, Reno-Orvis School of Nursing Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award. And with that, I'll turn things over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, everyone, or I guess I should say maybe good afternoon to some of you, depending on where you're joining me from. I am in Nevada, and it is an incredibly beautiful sky day out of my window, but the allergy weather, everything is blooming, so I apologize if I do a little nose dabbing throughout this. I'm actually very excited to spend some time with you and talk a bit about our academic journey as we tried to negotiate the pandemic. And I'm guessing as I speak, some of you will have some very, very similar stories or be able to relate to what I'm saying. So I'll go ahead and get going. Oops. There we go. Oh, that's a disclaimer. That's what I used to look like. This is what I look like now. So sort of a bait and switch for you. Just wanted to go over today's agenda. One of the things I will be discussing is really about how the pandemic changed teaching for us for that period of time. And that'll be interwoven throughout my talk with you today. I will go over a brief history of distance and online learning and what that looks like, and really try to identify some of the biggest differences that we know between education and learning from traditional face-to-face and online modalities. And then look at what were the roles that occurred between the faculty and students, discuss whether there are pedagogical differences between online and traditional learning and education. And then I'll just, like I said, talk about some of the strategies we use throughout this process, online learning, and again, the takeaways we have. So first, a little bit about us. We are a school of nursing within a state-funded land grant institution. And a few years ago, we were named right before the pandemic an R1 Carnegie Research University. We offer both undergraduate and graduate education programs. And within the undergraduate, we have a traditional program for entry. We also have our accelerated second baccalaureate. And then we have the RN to BSN program. In the graduate level, we offer a master's, a BSN to DNP, a postmaster's DNP, and then certificates within the various specialties, which include education, leadership, and practice, and the majority of those being nurse practitioner tracks. Currently, we have about 254 undergraduates and 275 graduate students matriculating in these programs. And both our graduate program and our RN to BSN program prior to the pandemic were existing online programs, and they were established for quite some time teaching online. So I think for those faculty and for those programs, it felt like business as usual, but not so much for everybody. So our story began on March 5th in Nevada. And it was when we had the first reported case of COVID, and that was in Las Vegas. And I don't know if you are familiar with the geographics of Nevada, But in the north, we have Reno, Sparks, Carson, that little urban suburban area of population. And then in the south, we have Las Vegas, Henderson area. And between us is 450 miles of desolate desert. They often call it the loneliest highway in the world, but I don't know if people were naive, we were just in denial, but it was like, oh, that's Las Vegas that, that COVID is starting within. Well, within a week, the governor then declared us under a state of emergency. And within 5 days, the governor called for all non-essential businesses, including the university, to close for at least 30 days. Now, for us, there was a bit of good news and bad news along the way, because just a few short days before March 17th, we started spring break. And so many students had already left campus to go home for spring break. And even though the pandemic was out there, some of our faculty also decided to leave and venture out on spring break, which led to some of our faculty being trapped throughout the country and not being able to get back as readily as they had hoped. During that week of spring break, those of us who were still on campus started to, I would say, create a thought process of what are we going to do? How are we going to do this with our students? And again, looking at Nevada, in between us and Las Vegas and that desert, Nevada is predominantly rural and frontier. And I say to my students when I'm teaching, I have had a patient that I've cared for multiple times in my career who lives 23 miles from his mailbox. So we are truly, we have students that live out in frontier, or as we lovingly refer to it as podunk. So with the start of March of 2020, not only for us, but really for the academic world, we abruptly changed. The mandate to get everybody off of campus, and many of us in nursing school quickly began to try and pivot to adapt our courses and the delivery methods that we would be using to ensure ongoing education for our students. Again, many of our faculty were off campus, were gone. And one of the things that immediately happened following spring break is, like all of you, we were forced into this two-dimensional world where we now had to learn to communicate very differently with our students. And I would say this was an unprecedented time. While the steps to develop curriculum during this time did not change, how we went about teaching, the strategies and the methods that we were going to use really were changing, especially for those faculty who predominantly only teach in the face-to-face traditional method. And so, like I said, there were a few faculty that seemed to be in a bit of frenzy, and those of us who had comfort with teaching online tried to help and figure out, here's what we could do. Well, with us being mandated to be off campus, if you could see my office, I work with 3 screens, and many of us work with 3 to 4 monitor screens. And it was pack up your office and leave. And so I remember getting home and trying to figure out, I had an old laptop, I had my new laptop, I had my iPad, and I had my iPhone. And in my office, they just zipped back and forth between screen to screen. But at home, it was, I had to pull up each one of those things on every one of the devices. And then I remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, I forgot my text. And can we go back onto campus? Can we go to the building? Can we get? And so I think that left a lot of us a little bit frantic at times of really, how are we going to pull this off? So with not just teaching the face-to-face and moving to online, one of the other things that happened were our students locally throughout the state and around the country were dismissed from their clinical spots. So we began to talk about, what are we going to do for clinical? How are we going to get this, and how are we going to continue to support our students and keep them engaged? And I think that weighed heavily on us for those students who really were supposed to graduate the end of that spring semester. We also were concerned about the face-to-face ability to evaluate and how that would look different as we moved into the virtual world. And what would we have as good evaluation techniques moving to the written communication as we did when we were able just to see students face-to-face or in real time, standing next to them. So the one thing that comes up then at the end was, as the big question is, just because we were able to adapt over the last 2 years, should we continue this way of teaching and the evaluation that we did? What do we know? And what has happened in the advancements of technologies? I don't know about you all, but I would say probably there was communication at least every day, if not multiple times during the day, from new products and applications that were popping up to be able to support us in this new adventure to either via online or distance learning education. So again, that question is, should we continue with what we and how we adapted? And I will tell you, during that 2 years, our university really has expanded the look of online and really are trying to, answer that question of what can we continue to offer online and what should we just stick with as traditional education. So a little bit from historical perspectives, distance or online and even e-learning are often used interchangeably, and the definitions are disputed within the literature. But the transition of education and learning came with the advancement of technology. So distance education itself is defined as any learning experience that takes place at a distance away from the parent educational institution's home campus. So this can include anything from just across the street from the campus to anywhere in the world. And distance education really has its core beginnings in the 1700s when a teacher offered lessons in shorthand. And this was really correspondence education, because what they would do is they packaged the lesson and they put it in the mail and sent it out to the students. And then the students would do their homework and their studies and then repackage it back and mail it back to the faculty. And so if you can imagine making sure you are meeting those date deadlines by going through the regular mail, they didn't, I guess, have the angst about it, maybe as we do now. During the 1800s, we saw these programs being provided from various colleges throughout the United States. And as technology continued to advance, we began with the satellite communications of the 1960s. And ultimately, during the 1980s, we advanced to fiber optic systems and ultimately the birth of the internet. And we know that that seriously changed how we communicate with everyone around the world. And what the birth of the internet did was really allow us to really have this growth and birth of significant distance online learning. I would say that the option of online learning does provide the educator and the learners the ability to really examine content in both a synchronous and asynchronous format. And we have to have that availability of a learning management system, an LMS, to really be able to do this. And the LMS systems, or the LMS that we should use, are really supposed to be developed specifically for academic learning, as well as the virtual learning environments. Now, why do I say that is, or why would it be of concern to us, is that within the healthcare professions, one of the things we want to make sure is that we have secure lines, because oftentimes we're talking about patients on our seminars and webinars when we're talking with students. So we really needed to make sure that these platforms were not only FERPA compliant, but also HIPAA compliant in many ways. And I should make a disclaimer right now, is that any of the products that I might mention throughout the this talk today, I'm not endorsing. These are just some of the examples that we used and some of the examples that I spoke with our colleagues across the country that they were using. And so as I say that, a lot of the big platforms to interact with students at a distance are the big blue button, Zoom, which became notorious, I think, for many, Teams, GoToMeeting, Google has a communication system. So all of those were available. And then, like I said, almost daily, there were new ones that were popping up throughout the pandemic. But despite the number of LMS and virtual learning systems that were there, the key was, did we know how to effectively use them? And did we have the support we needed to use them? So all of these certainly required computer access by both the faculty and the learners, and a major support from our IT department and the faculty expertise. And I would say not everybody is an expert at this technology. So some of the differences that were quickly identified is that whether you're online teaching or whether you're doing it through a traditional methodology, there are specific regulations to consider. One must think about recent updates and regulations and requirements of the U.S. Department of Education, and that came out in 2020 when all of this was happening. Now, some of them were a bit more laxed based on state-to-state requirements, but again, if your goal is ultimately after this experience to do much more online learning, I would recommend that you look at the U.S. Department of Education. And one of the big things is, how do we maintain FERPA with distance affiliates? The National Council for State Authorization and Reciprocity Agreements, also known as SARA, those of us who offer programs where our students are going to sit for licensure and national certifications, states vary regarding how we provide online learning. But what you really have to make sure is that if you're, like for us, if the student is attending your online education, and we're going to put, if you will, boots on the ground for them to attend their clinical, what state regulations do you have to meet? And so there's, at the university level, that we belong to SARA within multiple states, but then there are states where you're required specifically to go before the State Board of Nursing or the Department of Health, whoever oversees that licensure for the nurses, and make sure that they approve your program as one that can be utilized as online learning for residents within their state. And then finally, during all of this, international students, for most learning visas, we have students that are able to do about 1/3 of their education online, and the other 2/3 had to be face-to-face. Now, some of that was relaxed again throughout the pandemic, but we experienced, what do we do with our international students? We didn't have many in the nursing program at that time, but throughout the rest of the campus, we have a considerable amount of international students. And with the campus and housing closing, what were we going to do with these students, and how were we going to keep them connected with us when they were trying to get home? And then on top of that, some of them could not get home because we had restricted travel in and out of the country. And so ultimately, they did not get to go home for a period of time. And what was also interested, they stayed in housing on campus then. But for those that did go home, it was like, when are they asleep? When are we awake? Do we record our lectures? Again, how do we keep them engaged? And a lot of that really relied on, whether the student, we did classes more in the early morning and they were there attending late at night. And also with Zoom, we had that opportunity. We did use Zoom, and we had that opportunity to record. And so students ultimately listened to those recordings when they were awake. The final thing is costs, and do they exist between online and face-to-face programs? Is one cheaper than the other? There are some things that it really truly depends on, but overall, they would say that face-to-face programs actually have more overhead than do online programs. Online programs may have a beginning of extra expenses as you make sure you have your apps in place, the virtual learning environments, the learning management systems, etc. If you ask the parents, they would say it was a lot cheaper to have them back home. They weren't paying for campus housing or meal tickets or that kind of thing. But ultimately, there is a very big difference in costs. And what you would see if you looked in the literature is it says that there is a reduced cost for online learning versus the traditional face-to-face. So some of the continued identifying differences between online and traditional face-to-face, the startup cost. One of the things that we really, when we were thinking about all of this is some of the costs we did not ever have before, or for a full university, like proctoring specialties in that. And everybody started using proctoring for quizzes, whether they were formative or summative, high risk, low risk, and the cost went up exponentially immediately for the entire campus. So we were asked to relook at that to what really were high risk stake type exams that we had to have a proctored type of situation, and what of them could be much more low risk. The other thing we had to worry about, especially for our students, were their ability to access and the bandwidth. And again, like I said, some of our students are out in rural and frontier Nevada. I don't know if you remember, but certainly I remember the crash and the problems of Zoom during August, where I think the whole world was on Zoom at the same time and just everything started to go down. The learner composition you have to think about between traditional and online distance students. There's many different reasons that our learners choose a traditional program over an online program, much like what our faculty said is that, there are reasons they prefer to teach face-to-face versus online. So most of the time with nursing, a lot of the working nurses choose an online format because of the flexibility that it allows with family life, work, and school balance. And we are able then to recruit students from these rural areas, though, that would normally, have to try and find a face-to-face and the problems with doing that and uprooting their families or themselves. And then, of course, both synchronous and asynchronous presentations can be used with both options. But when we did start to come back to campus, we moved into sometimes a hybrid where we left students at home for part of that week for their didactic and then brought them to the campus for specific testing or simulations. Between the faculty and students, we certainly noticed a lot of big differences. First of all, faculty specifically are no longer that sage on the stage, if you will, but really are facilitators to guide learning for our students. Within an organized class and course, do you all have a standard for how online courses look? We have a resource within the school that can help us build our courses to look all the same, but I would say not all faculty do that. For students, it really is helpful because if they can open an online course and everything is in the same place and easy to access, it's much easier for them. They're not struggling to try and learn the technology versus the content. Building a community is a responsibility, and again, doing synchronous lectures, putting students together in groups. And, some students are very funny about, it was interesting. Well, why are you naming us groups like that? Could we have this name instead of that name? Yes, if that's what you want to call yourselves, I'll change it on the Canvas website, but absolutely. Promoting engagement, most importantly through the assignments. and being a strong communicator, not just in speaking, but also in writing, because a lot of the communication is in the written format. What kind of equipment do you have? And can you go anywhere? And what apps do you need? And then what we call netiquette. And that, I would say, is really the faculty's responsibility of role modeling what you want. Just because it's online doesn't mean it should be a casual environment. For the students, I would say, for the most part, students who select online learning, they are self-directed, they have active participation, they're organized, and they know how to balance their time. Sometimes that is true, sometimes that is not. Some students, depending on how long they're out from undergraduate education and what their previous online experience are, still need some support. Again, strong communication skills. Can they write? What can I say? It was a big wow and aha moment when we're used to our undergraduates back and forth speaking, but when it came to their writing skills, I think we were all in a bit of shock that their writing skills did not necessarily measure up to their verbal skills. And again, does everybody have the equipment they need? And can they afford the equipment they need for this? And then netiquette of the students, I think we probably all have stories about what were going on behind the participants as we were looking out into that Zoom world. And, it goes to, should we mandate cameras be on, cameras be off? Do they have, should they have a standard background? Those types of things. But some of what I experienced, I may never forget. Okay. Oh, I apologize. I guess I didn't advance that slide. My most sincere apologies. Right. So the differences, and do they exist? As many of us found out during this time, if we weren't already teaching online, you just can't take classroom content and deliver it online with the expectation of the same outcomes. There are many learning theories and frameworks that guide educators really in selecting the correct methods in delivering content. And so in examining the differences in the formats of online and face-to-face, are there differences in pedagogy? And the immediate answer to that question is yes and no, depending on who you ask. So in our School of Nursing, those who are not already teaching in an online format tried to do exactly what I first said. They took what they were doing face-to-face and just tried to deliver it in the online format via Zoom. And they quickly found out that it wasn't successful. So those of us who do teach online, we're trying to quickly scramble to help those find applications that would work for them and try to fix things to make it a little bit easier for them. So if you really examine the literature itself, though, the true answer is there are very distinct differences in methods, strategies, and practices of teaching or the pedagogy between online and traditional face-to-face education, as well as learning. For predominantly in online, we use androgyny or adult learning and the constructs of distance learning. In the literature, it's often argued that there are three historical approaches to the development of theory in distance education. And those three are the first being the theory of autonomy and independence. And that really is a reflection and an essential component of, is the learner independent? The second would really be the industrialization, or what's really referred to as the field of distance education, as an industrialized form of teaching and learning. And then the third integrates the theories of interaction and communication. And that really is, do you have both students and faculty who are able to communicate verbally and through the written communication, if you will, to make sure content is delivered in a successful manner. So the constructs, though, of distance learning and online learning have four components, one of those being transactional or distance, transactional distance. And that is the amount of dialogue that is happening between the student and the faculty. So is that only happening once a week? Does that happen in a webinar? That type of thing, which goes on to say, what is the interaction? And that interaction is an interaction between faculty, student to student. But what provides the motivation? How do you give feedback? And that continued dialogue between the teacher and student. And so student and content interaction are how do they obtain their intellectual information that's being provided from the material. Then you have student to student, and that sharing of information can come either in a structured or non-structured form. It's them being able to share their ideas and dialogue and trying to still be connected and socialized within and about the course. And then if a student, like I said previously, if they're interacting more with the technology and trying to figure out where everything is, then learning really isn't occurring for them. For the student side in that too, we know that students really have to have that inner locus of control, and they're more likely to be successful when they have that. Are they independent, competent, and supported? And then finally, within the social context, that again is what affects their motivations, their attitudes, what affects your teaching for their ability to learn. And I don't know about you, but we got a lot of feedback about both positive and significantly negative feedback about the amount of group work that happened during this time. For traditional, the theories that we know most commonly are the behaviorist learning, the cognitive learning, and the constructivist learning. And all of those are either how knowledge is acquired through conditioning, how thinking or thinking about thinking influences the learning, and then ultimately how they have the building blocks and their experiences and what they build on to move forward. So some of the activities that throughout that promoted teaching and learning for our students. One of the things within synchronous learning, there's difference between how do you engage them between synchronous and asynchronous. And one of the things we found out that our students really liked was gamification and digital teach applications, things like Nearpod, where they were interacting, polls, the faculty would put it up and they immediately got that gratification of knowing whether their answer was right or wrong and seeing what their other peers were answering. And so a lot of our undergraduate program faculty started to use those applications to really engage the students. Like I said, the immediate feedback motivated them to continue to participate. We brought in clinical experts from the community throughout the state and actually nationwide for our doctoral program to really talk and hear a different perspective of what was going on elsewhere and how to prepare the student for their ultimate graduation and going out into the world as it had changed throughout the pandemic. We had simulated clinical experiences, and there's lots of different applications that you can use that have avatars so that the students could interact with the avatars. And then we also had student presentations, the last being some of them were okay with that. Some of them really didn't like that. Some of them really just wanted us to deliver the message and have them move on. Within asynchronous, many of the faculty also used video capture or voice over PowerPoints, podcasts, and then they would follow with a very brief assignment of maybe 4 to 5 questions for the student to answer on a discussion board. Faculties created evolving case studies where they might start the case study and then send it out to the students to actually finish up. Faculty provided not only written, but we found, who knew it was there, but we found that there is the opportunity to give recorded feedback, and the students loved hearing our voices as well. They were looking at the paper, their submission, of us saying, if you will look in this paragraph here, you can see, and giving them feedback not only about their writing, but also about APA formatting and that. And so a lot of us have adapted that or adopted that and are continuing that throughout. Discussion boards, we changed up a little bit. We allowed for a little bit more engagement in that. The first week we would post a discussion and the students had time to put their discussion up. And then the second week was that their peers could respond to them. And not having to do both in 1 week, we really saw a lot more response and a lot more thought in those responses from peer to peer. And then again, faculty initiated concept mapping. And so I wanted to give you some examples of concept mapping that we gave. When we teach the 3 Ps now, pathophysiology, pharmacology, and physical health assessment, we do that with concept mapping. And one of the things that really allows us to do is we say it's not just for undergraduates anymore, it's for the graduate student too. And what that allows us to do is really assess their clinical reasoning and critical thinking as it's developing from a bedside RN to an APRN. And I thank my colleague, Megan Pratt, Dr. Pratt is our track leader for the F&P and adult Gero primary care programs. And these are just examples of what students did within the pathophysiology. And what she actually had them do is look at this here. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can see it above or not, but is chest pain, and to look at why does chest pain occur from a systematic view as well, and to construct that for them. There were some concept maps. This is from Dr. Schindel. And again, she teaches within our family nurse practitioner program. And so this is part of the health assessment. And so she gave them nausea, vomiting, and these bolded areas. And then the students use that to fill them in. And then we have, this is more of a blank view of that concept mapping. And we will give them maybe a problem, and they have to give us the feedback of pathophys, and then this within pharmacy, so they connect those points. This is what happens, pathophysiology. These are some of the assessments I have to make, and these are the medications that I would prescribe for that process. Not everything about the pandemic, I would say, was really bad. What we do in clinical now is very, very different. When we had to pull everybody back into this virtual world, we started using avatars, and what we would have them do, it was mandated. They came in dressed as they were seeing a patient face to face. So we expected them to dress out as they would if they were in the clinical setting. They went in, they interacted with their avatars. We brought them back out of their breakout rooms. They met with faculty, and they would present to the faculty what they found with their patient problem. And then we would go and meet as a group. And within that group, we would talk about their problem list. What are their differential diagnoses? What are your do not miss types of diagnoses? What is your plan of action? And we weren't doing that as intensively as we do now since the pandemic. And it's very interesting. Our community partners and stakeholders said to us, what are you doing with your students? I have never seen them so prepared now to come into the clinical. They know their differentials. They know, diagnoses to go in the plan of care. And so, having to scramble and look for a way to keep our graduate students really connected and engaged with clinical when they weren't in clinical was really a challenge for us. But this was one of the ways that we were able to do it. And like I said, the faculty came in dressed as if they were going to be out in the community with those students at their clinical sites and vice versa. And we did that as well with our undergraduates. So when we were able to start bringing them in small groups back to campus, that was very helpful as we launched our simulations. But the biggest problem through all of this, again, was for some of our rural students and making sure that they really had access to us and the bandwidth to be able to do some of these things. So evaluation really of the online learning process. Again, our university called us to arms to say, is this formative? Is this a low stake? Is this summative? Are these really high stakes? And when we were using the proctoring applications, if you will, many schools have thought, but you have to consider literally what promotes learning. Does open book promote learning if you have them on a time frame? I would say yes, because our students continued to do well even with open book when we offered group type meetings and that for them to work together as a group on a test. We did see that learning was happening for them. And then I think finally is that, when we look at evaluations, there's the college and university evaluation that gets handed out to the student at the end of every semester. And I would tell you from an undergraduate point of view, they wanted to get back. They wanted the campus experience. For the graduate, the biggest issue was about clinical, but they were still very, very satisfied with the program and the way the program was delivered. Student evaluation, again, office hours, we held online office hours like this, but they wanted that face-to-face, the undergraduates at least. One of the things a lot of the faculty used, especially at midterm, but they did it a few of them did it every couple of weeks. And that was, what do you want me to start? What do you need me to stop? And what do you want me to continue? And it was set up anonymously so students could give feedback. And that's where we found some of our stumbling blocks of what was working and what was not working. Students love doing Nearpod. And like I said, the games and the polls that we were delivering to them, that really helped keep them engaged. One of the things I wouldn't tell you to do is ever go out and look at Rate My Professor. Those are not always the most special things to do. But if you're thick-skinned, it also gives you a view of maybe some of what they're thinking of. We did have very good outcomes even during this time. Our national certification results at the graduate level stayed high. We faltered just slightly with our undergraduate responses, but overall it seemed to hold steady for our success to be able to deliver what we needed to our students during this time. So that ends my presentation. Do we have any questions out there?
Yes, we do. So this is from Susan Yale. She actually phrased it in two different ways, so I'll try to consolidate that for everybody. Our RN to BSN program was 80% online and 20% in person. Our ADN was fully face-to-face. I think it was before the pandemic. I find that the ADN students struggle with online more than RN to BSN.
Yes.
And she teaches at Wenatchee Valley College in Washington State.
I would say you are 100% correct about that. And we experienced the very same story. Our RN to BSN students felt very, very comfortable. They didn't even feel like there was a hiccup. The type of clinical we expect them to do, and that is very, very different. It's not really going about to the bedside. It's more about that clinical of community and looking at how systems work as opposed to hands-on, because they're very good at already hands-on nursing. For our undergraduate, for our traditional students, they struggled. And like I said, we did see a dip in our NCLEX pass rates. They want that on campus. And I would tell you, it's very difficult. I'm not going to lie. It was very difficult to try and continue to give some type of online, or excuse me, that on-campus feeling through online. I wouldn't say there was any one special thing. One of our younger faculty who's very technologically savvy, she threw a lot of apps at them. And they actually, I don't mean a lot, but different types of apps like that. And they really enjoyed it. They felt connected. And when they got back onto campus, I think that was the biggest takeaway for all of us, is that we kept hearing over and over and over, they missed the socialization. Where was that connection? And so we experienced the very same thing. I don't think that is any different between the two of us. And I don't have a magic correction. I will say, though, some of the courses that, the research course, the students were very okay with continuing online, but the theory courses, they want to be face-to-face. They want to be able to have that immediate ability to either raise their hand or talk, out and ask the question, which they did not feel they could do on Zoom. They felt very isolated from the faculty on Zoom.
Okay, this is from an anonymous attendee. What does research show about concept mapping improving clinical judgment, undergraduate, and clinical decision-making on the graduate side?
It is very pro on supporting that. We actually, like I said, we have been using concept mapping for our undergraduates for many, many years. And one of the things that we really, in the literature shows this, is concept mapping is one of the best ways to teach critical thinking and clinical reasoning, and to assess those two as well. And we had the aha moment when some of the new programs for our nurse practitioners, where we started to see them struggling, where they couldn't adapt away from being a bedside nurse, and implementing this concept mapping for the graduate students, again, really supported our ability to assess whether they were putting these connections together. And we did a qualitative research with those students as well, and found out that what is in the literature, they continued to say. And what it was we hated this. We thought it was tedious. It was just jump through the hoop. And that was their original thoughts. And then it was, I can't believe how much this supported me going into the clinical setting and knowing what I was saying, what I was doing was correct. And that is supported in the literature.
Okay. There are a few questions about cameras. So Jacqueline Savory Bram, her question was, what were your findings related to camera on or off for students? And then Susan Yale kind of continued that same question as Jacqueline. Did you find a best practice for cameras? We teach in a very rural setting. Many of our students are parents and struggle financially and with internet access. So we were trying to be inclusive. Some were working well in our Zoom session when I required a rubric with peer review with cameras on. So questions about the camera.
Sure, no, those are all great. And cameras were a struggle for all of us. Some of the faculty didn't care whether the camera were on or off. And we found out that when cameras were off, there was better bandwidth. And so to support our rural students in that, we left their cameras off. It depended on what the day was. When, there was a little bit more leniency from our perspective, from our faculty, when it was us delivering the content. When we had guests, we prepared the students prior and said, we are having a guest speaker and we would like you to be, if possible, in a more, convenient and conducive environment, as opposed to your bedroom where your husband who works nights may still be asleep. But ultimately, people's lives continued. Now, the argument came with this, is that because they could Zoom in from anywhere, they were doing things that they wouldn't normally have done. So we did say that whether you have your camera on or off, you have to be attentive and you have to block this time as you would if you were coming in face to face, sitting down in front of us. But, did some of them still take their iPhone and travel through the grocery store with their iPhone? Yes, I'm sure they did. We did not come up with a mandated policy for the university nor for the School of Nursing, because, like I said, some of our faculty, like what you were saying about the type of students you have, we felt that any connection we could continue with those students was better than no connection at all.
And Stephanie, I think I missed the context of this question, so I'm not sure if this is going to make sense, but the question was, what were the apps? This is from
The applications, oh goodness sakes, I wrote a bunch of them down too that we use, so I wouldn't forget. Mentimeter, we used a lot with, that's a polling, and so that we could get that. Nearpod, we did, oh my gosh, my mind just went blank of, we did Rosh Review. Like I said, I'm not trying to endorse any of these products. Oh my gosh, it just went right out of my mind. I'm trying to think of, because we used iHuman for our graduate students, and we found iHuman was not as effective currently for our undergraduate students, and they went to a new,
somebody's mentioning poll.
If I can think of it, I'll write it in. I'm sorry.
Okay, is it Poll Everywhere? Somebody mentioned that in the chat.
I'm sorry?
Poll Everywhere?
Poll Everywhere. Kahoot is another one. There's platforms for polling within Zoom, and Nearpod definitely.
Okay. You had mentioned that the students struggled with the group work in the online environment. Could you just talk a little bit about that, and then what your takeaway is moving into the future?
Because we were so closed down, places that they would normally have gotten together, like Starbucks or, even to come on campus, we have group meeting rooms and that, they were not allowed to come to the library or anything. And so they felt that it was much more difficult to get into really connecting with each other, and that just online, which sort of is funny based on the fact that a lot of them use Zoom, or not Zoom, excuse me, are texting and TikTok and sending all of that kind of thing. But that's one of the things they kept saying, is they were struggling to use this type of communication as opposed to be able to get into a group. And they found similarly, what we were complaining about between the faculty is students were doing something else. They weren't connected. When you could harness all of us within a room, is what they said, we got things done. But when we were on Zoom, people just got up and walked to the bathroom, went and got a snack. They didn't stay focused and engaged. And so they struggled with using that modality to actually complete group work. The other thing is they don't like group work overall, even in a face-to-face traditional, because there's always the one person who does the bulk of the work and the others who don't participate. And I said that, we all say, that's part of the learning process. When you're in the clinical environment after you graduate, people aren't just going to look at you and assess that you need help. You have to be able to speak out about that. And that's what part of group work is trying to teach you as well. So those were some of the struggles they reported.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephanie. If you could go to the next slide, it's time to wrap up.
All right. Oh, that looks familiar.
So Stephanie's has put a lot of hard work into this book. So Stephanie took over for Sarah Keating, who I think probably a lot of you know. The book is Keating's Curriculum Development and Evaluation in Nursing Education. It's been a successful text through the years. We just published this edition in February. You can just go to springerpub.com for information. There's some other information about purchase and getting a discount. And then in the next slide, Stephanie, there's an email address. If you have any questions about the presentation, about adopting the book, you want to get in touch with Dr. DeBoer, you can contact us at marketing@springerpub.com. And we would like to thank everybody for participating, and especially Dr. DeBoer for giving us such a great presentation today.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye, everyone.